everybody. Welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. I'm Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And if you watched a recent episode, we discussed why go mirrorless. And today we are going to tell you or suggest to you why you could stay with your DSLR, or if you are just getting into underwater photography, why a DSLR might be the move versus going to a mirrorless camera. So Alex, if you would like to take it away.
Yeah, it's a really good topic. And I think it's important to say to people that there isn't a clear yes, right or wrong answer to either of those questions. And there are a lot of individual factors in this. And I will regularly get asked by, two photographers over lunch, say on a workshop. And one of them, my answer will be yes, get yourself a Z8, get yourself an R5, get yourself an A7 R5, go into that full frame mirrorless world. And to another one, I'll say, you know what? You're taking great pictures of your D850, keep shooting that camera. You're doing 1 or 2 trips a year. You might as well keep enjoying that camera. It's perfect for what you're doing. Or you might be a D500 user, and the versatility you're getting with that 10 to 17, Tokina is just worth so much to you. You're gonna throw so much away going to mirrorless. So there's a lot of individual factors in this based on the gear that you're coming from and what you personally are doing as a diver, as a photographer. So that's why we wanted to do it as 2 episodes. So the first thing I would say is that SLRs are still great cameras, and do not let any marketing hype, any jealousy that someone else has got new gear than you, any of that convince you otherwise, because the last generation of SLRs really, I think one of the reasons the camera companies introduced mirrorless cameras is they almost had nowhere to go with the SLRs. They were topped out in terms of specs. They had fantastic autofocus. They had fantastic sensors. They were hugely capable cameras, and they remain so. Just because newer, shinier cameras have come out does suddenly not make those cameras bad. And in fact, to many people, those cameras will remain as a high watermark that really represents what's capable. So more than anything, do not let the marketing hype, the fact that other people have got shiny new gear, make you mistaken in thinking that the last generation of SLR cameras were anything other than fantastic cameras. Yeah. So, anyone who wants to continue using one of those, that is not a bad decision. They are great pieces of kit.
Yeah. And like you sort of touched on, just because new cameras come out doesn't mean those old ones are bad. It doesn't mean they're irrelevant or you can't use them anymore. It just means there's new technology and newer cameras. But one thing that I will touch on that is important to me is that an advantage of DSLR is that there is a huge market now of used equipment. So housing, cameras, lenses, all of that stuff. The prices compared to what they were even 2 or 3 years ago is ridiculous. You can get an entire DSLR setup. Like, we'll use a D500 for example. I saw one on eBay recently. You had macro port, mini dome, housing, and something else for like $1,500. That when that camera came out, that whole rig would have cost you $7,000. So if you're looking to get in, this is more for people if you're looking to get into underwater photography, that DSLR might be the route, just because it's a much lower barrier for entry, because you have great cameras and really nice used housings that you can get for a fraction of what they cost when they were new, and a fraction of what a new mirrorless rig will probably cost you right out of the gate.
And it really is a buyer's market out there, particularly with the underwater photography gear. And the reason for that is of course that lots of people who do underwater photography, they do it as a hobby. It's an area they enjoy spending their hard-earned money on, and they get pleasure from owning and buying the latest, greatest gear, and they really enjoy using that gear. And I would never tell anyone that they shouldn't take that enjoyment from the hobby, because certainly there's many hobbies around the world where using the latest, greatest gear is a huge part of the enjoyment of that hobby. So, what it does mean is that with a large number of underwater photographers wanting to use the latest gear, if you're willing not to use the latest gear, it is a buyer's market. Do your research, because obviously there's plenty of underwater photographers out there who just, 3 years ago dropped 7,000 on a new set of gear, and don't understand what it's worth now. And you will see some of them priced to sell and others priced based on what someone paid for them. And, just be careful you don't pay way over what you need to be paying, because I think a little bit of research will quite quickly tell you that some items don't lose their value, and things like the ports often don't lose the value because they can be moved across, and viewfinders don't lose the value. But particularly the housings and the camera bodies, they can really drop in value, not because they're bad, just because the majority of the hobbyists don't want to be using them. Yeah. And particularly if you want to have a second system, it can be a great time to just get a complete second system for really good money. Yeah. Right, it's my turn, isn't it? Sorry. I would say if you are a current SLR user, the best way to get amazing new photos is not to buy the latest mirrorless camera, but is instead to spend that money on getting out there in the field and getting out diving, going to great destinations, doing more dives. And I would say that's probably one of the strongest reasons I say to current underwater photographers who are talking about the mirrorless upgrade. It's like, yeah, you could spend, 5,000 plus switching yourself over to mirrorless, or you can do a couple of amazing trips for that money and have some fantastic new pictures taken with your D850 or your 5D, Mark IV, whatever you're shooting at the moment. Yeah. And just because someone on that trip is going to have a fancy new mirrorless camera, does not mean your shots are not going to be better than theirs. And in fact, I run lots of workshops, and, the number of SLRs is slowly reducing. It's some workshops, it's still the majority. Others, it's just slipping into the minority. It does vary. But one thing I can say is a lot of the experienced shooters are the people out there running those last generation SLRs. And if you came to choosing one of the best shots on the trip, they often are coming from those SLR shooters. So, do not feel in any way inferior shooting an SLR, because time and again, I see people using those cameras and producing amazing underwater photos.
Yep. And one of the areas that I think DSLRs still more than hold their own against mirrorless are the sensors. Touched on this in our mirrorless episode too, but there's only so much you can do with a sensor in terms of its image quality. A full frame sensor is a full frame sensor. Until you get bigger and move up to medium format, there's only so much trickery you can do to squeeze out more image quality. And cameras like the D850 or my favorite camera of all time, the Nikon D4, have amazing files that your
D4 has got great files.
Yeah.
So it's why I bought a D5. Just because the D4 file I loved it so much more than I'm getting really sidetracked here. So much more than the D800 files, even though the D800 files were higher res, that I just assumed it would be the same in the next generation, and was really shocked by the fact that actually the D850 was better than the D5. Yeah. In terms of that. But
yeah, so those sensors still, you can create world-class images with them. That doesn't really have any. So if image quality is of the utmost importance to you, you're not losing anything necessarily by staying with DSLR, especially if you have good optics. And I'm still debating picking up a used D4 just to have it again because I loved it so much. Yeah. And I have lots of prints from that camera. Some of my favorite pictures ever were taken from that. So even not the latest generation, but the one before that, still more than holds its own with regards to image quality and the sensor quality.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I went from D850 to shot the A1, the A7R5, the Z8 a lot in the last year, and the D850 lower ISO image quality I think is ahead of all of those.
Yeah.
I think that the A7R5 is pretty close to it and has obviously got more resolution with it. And obviously, that D850 is a Sony sensor. So, the Sony cameras, do get pretty close to it. The A1, I think, is not as good as the D850 at lower ISO. I don't think it quite has the color richness, the dynamic range but it has at higher ISO, it's much better than the D850. Yeah. It's super, super clean and really impressive. So, it's also, and I don't shoot that much ISO 4,000 underwater. So, the advantages of the A1 are maybe less in tune to the sort of underwater photography I do than the D850. So, not for a second should you think that you're giving anything away image quality wise.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times now it's really splitting hairs between what sensor you want to use. So as long as you're using well, let's stick with full frame. If you're using a full frame sensor, generally these days they're all fantastic. And like you said, if you're using them all, you can split hairs and find advantages here and there. But for the vast majority of shooters, all of those sensors are going to give you spectacular image quality, assuming you're exposing properly and all that kind of thing. But
sure. Right. Well, the point I'm going to bring up next is a slightly tongue-in-cheek one, and that's to say size and weight of the gear. And this was something we were going to cover in the Why Go Mirrorless episode, and then in the end, it really is such a complex subject and not really an advantage that I thought it was better almost to put it in this episode. In that mirrorless cameras are generally a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter than SLR cameras, but not by very much. The lenses are still the same size. The housings are pretty much still the same size. The ports are definitely the same size. The system weight with your strobe arms and strobes on is still the same size. So going to full frame mirrorless and thinking that it's going to save you any size and weight over your SLR is not a clear advantage. It's probably not going to happen for most people. Just depend on what camera you go from, what to what. But certainly if you went from a Nikon, D750 to a Nikon Z9, you're definitely going up in weight, not down in weight. So it can go both ways. So don't for a moment think that it's a saving. So I would say size and weight is in the SLR camp, in that it's a false promise to think that mirrorless can give you a size and weight saving, because in the end you still need the same size dome ports to get the same performance out of them. You still need the same size lenses. You still need the same size wet optics. You still need the same size strobes and strobe arms and viewfinders. And even if the housing is 5% smaller in the system as a whole, that 5% just gets absorbed by everything else. So there's no advantage to mirrorless in size and weight, and that is therefore, I think, a plus point in SLR camps.
So I was gonna discuss the lens choices for SLR, but before we forget, do you want to discuss the optical viewfinders?
Yeah. I mean, I think that yes, I think that's a good one. It's a complicated issue again a little bit, in that during the mirrorless episode, I very much said that one of the things I love about mirrorless is the electronic viewfinder and the fact it can do so many things beyond a normal viewfinder. We didn't even talk about much like peaking or subject magnification. All those, when you shoot black and white, you can just turn it to black and white and see the world in black and white, which is amazing for black and white available light photography. But there is definitely something pure about an optical viewfinder. It gives a beautiful bright view in the right conditions. It can handle a huge dynamic range because it gives you the same dynamic range that your eyes can see. And so if you're framing up, say, a dark reef and a bright sunburst, when you look at the dark reef, your eye adjusts to the dark reef and you can see the detail in the dark reef. When you look up at the sunburst, your eye adjusts and you can see exactly the school of fish or the diver swimming across the sunburst. So in terms of dynamic range viewing, which is quite a common thing, high dynamic range viewing is quite a common thing for an underwater photographer. Yes, the optical viewfinder is better. But I have to say, I think from experience, if you give most keen underwater photographers a mirrorless camera for a dive trip, by the end of that trip, if you put them back on an SLR, they'd miss the EVF. Whereas at the beginning of the trip, they'll moan about the EVF. There's a little bit of human psychology in that, but there's also, I think, real truth that they both have advantages. And I think when I first switched to mirrorless, I was very much, the EVF is a disadvantage compared to an optical viewfinder, sort of the straight through mirrored viewfinder, prism mirror of an SLR. I subsequently feel that actually it's much more nuanced than that. And if I had to decide, I'd stay EVF, which, would shock me 12 months ago for me to hear me say that.
All right, so now I'll move on to another advantage for DSLR is because they've been around forever, you have a massive lens choice. So admittedly, the lenses you're going to choose to use underwater is more limited than the options you have for out there. But one of the big ones is you have a native fisheye for all of the different, so Canon and Sony both, which are mainly the two SLRs, both have native fisheyes. You also have the Sigma fisheye available for it. And a lot of those, this ties back in with what I mentioned earlier about the used prices, is because everybody's moving to mirrorless, a lot of those really, really high-end lenses you can now find for, bargain prices. And it doesn't mean that their optics are any worse. It just means that people are moving on and selling the stuff that they have. So if, again, it's kind of the same thing, if you're just getting into this, you can have access to a huge number of really high quality lenses for much less cost than buying all new mirrorless ones. So it's another thing to think about if you're just getting into this or even if you're upgrading from an old DSLR and you're not sure if it's time to go mirrorless, the lens selection is still bigger and more diverse for DSLR, and at this point, much more affordable.
Yeah, and it's not a completely black and white issue though. With adapters, you can adapt a lot of those interesting lenses onto mirrorless cameras. I think it's much easier with mirrorless cameras to adapt different brands of lenses to your camera. You can't really use a Canon SLR lens on a Nikon SLR easily, but you can very easily use Canon and Nikon lenses on a Sony underwater, for example. I also like the fact that actually on my Sony I can shoot some weird lenses, like using a Nikonos viewfinder camera, so the Nikonos 5, for example, 15mm lens. So I quite like that. And so it's a nuanced and it's a complex subject, right? The final one I was going to say, which is I think is important to a lot of people, is that there is a learning curve with switching to mirrorless cameras. They have endless customization in the menus. They can be intimidating, and there's always this feeling that there might be a couple of settings that will give you an even more suited camera to that type of shooting. And I definitely feel with my mirrorless cameras that I set the camera up very differently if I'm shooting reef wide angle to if I'm shooting available light wide angle. And it's, excuse me, it's probably 4 or 5 different settings that I would make just to change from using exactly the same camera and lens from doing one type of shot to another, in terms of changing how I review images and changing how I set the EVF up, changing how I set the autofocus up, picture modes, that sort of thing, and autofocus as well. And with that customization and complexity, for some people, that's a great thing to attract you to mirrorless. But I think for a lot of photographers, they don't want underwater photography to be more complex. They want to know what's the best way to do the shots, set the camera up, and enjoy the underwater photography, not enjoy what settings it got to be on and that sort of thing. And so if you see yourself as someone who enjoys the underwater photography side of underwater photography, then maybe mirrorless is going to suit you less than an SLR. And I think it's an important point, because not everyone wants to have to learn a whole new set of menus, a whole new set of meanings, a whole new... And there's also that feeling that you haven't got it set up right, and someone out there knows more than you, and they'll be able to, they'll have a much more user-friendly camera. And that can be frustrating for people. And it's something that I spend a lot of time when, at the moment, all my workshops, it's like, there's another 3 or 4 people turning up on the next workshop. Yeah, this is my first time with my new mirrorless camera. What settings do I need? And there's a lot of what we're doing now on the workshops is, in between lectures and things, is getting people's cameras set up right. And then saying, okay, now we're going to do macro, switch these things around or whatever. Yeah. So that complexity is not for everyone. And consider that carefully. You don't have to dive into that. But if you don't, there's always a feeling that you haven't quite got things set up as well as they could be.
Yep. I think that's everything, I don't think I'm forgetting anything. So with that, it seems like a good place to wrap up. If you haven't watched our mirrorless one, please go watch our mirrorless one as well if you're considering making the jump. And other than that, we'll see you guys next time.